There were the Essenes. There's another group of people. They all, it was kind of like the Democrats, Republicans, and Libertarians. Not necessarily the same, but the same idea, right? You have a group of people who had a different perspective on how things were going to go. And what was their perspective different on? How God would fulfill the promise he made. They all had different perspectives as to how God would fulfill his promises. The Pharisees had one perspective, and they all called the fulfillment of these promises the hope of Israel. It was their hope. How God would work, and they never doubted the fact that they should have a hope. They never doubted the fact that God would fulfill his promise. The difference laid in how they thought he would do it. The Pharisees had one vision. The Sadducees had another's. The Essenes had another. And there was another group, and I've lost them. I can't remember. The Zealots, there it is. The Zealots had a completely different version, right? Some thought we should take it into our own hands. Others said we sit back and wait. Others said we sit way back and wait. We just go off into the hills somewhere, live holy, and hope God works this thing out. And others said, no, I think we're going to help God bring it in. That was their idea. Just varieties, different perspectives. It differed. They all had a hope. They all knew how God was going to do it. I think sometimes in the Christian church we've kind of lost that. We talk about what we're doing. We're talking about what we're doing next week. We're talking about how to either build our church or how to build this program or how to do that, this or the other thing. But when was the last time we talked about how God would fulfill his promise for the world with us? It's a big vision. Or when was the last time we talked about what God wants to do with my life? The reason why I'm following all of these prescriptions, these things. We really do beat on the Pharisees a good bit, and for good reason. Right? But there's one thing you could never fault the Pharisees for. They had a hope. They knew where they were going. How they worked that out may have been a little bit in error. Jesus exposed that. That's why we know it. We're not saying it of our own. Jesus exposed the error. But the fact that they had something they longed for, and the fact that I think they lived by that daily, that pushed them forward, that's undeniable. And I think in the Christian church, that's where we're standing. What's the target? Where are you going? What's God want from you? Because at the end of the day, this is what this book of Revelation is kind of talking. That's what this is talking about. What we have longed for. The hope of the church. The hope of the church. What are we hoping for? What is the message that we think the world needs to hear? I don't listen to it often, but every once in a while I catch it. I don't listen to much radio, honestly. I really don't. It's just background noise, but every once in a while you get like the river, or I think there's a new one, the fish. Just a side question, has nothing to do with the sermon, but I'm just wondering, why is it all Christian stations are aquatic? You ever notice that? All aquatic. You got the river, you got the fish, the ocean, I don't know. A lot of water, a lot of fish, a lot of sea animals. Don't know what it is. Anyways, that's just a side note. We call it the loaf. I don't know. I mean, that'd be different, right? How's that? Airways. But I'm listening, I don't think it's wrong, but I think the way they say is, hey, positive and encouraging. Okay, our music is positive and encouraging. Your kids will never have to ask you, what does that mean? Which I don't know if that's a bad question, actually, but positive, I'm all for positive. I'm all for encouraging. I hope the mission's bigger than that, though. Because I'd hate that to be the church's mission. We are positive and encouraging. Great. And so is a bar, actually. Right? They can be positive and encouraging. So is a gym. Right? Planet Fitness. No judgment zone. Positive and encouraging. They offer you candy at the front door. That's positive and encouraging. Right? Church has got to be more than that. It's got to be more than just positive and encouraging. Right? I think we are. And we must be. Life-altering. How about that for a motto? Life-transforming. Saving. Redemptive. Rebirthing. Healing. Those are powerful words that no advertisement would ever dare do because they can't fulfill that. But the church can. We can take that risk because it's not much of a risk at all when you know who the healer is, who the savior is. So, what is your goal, mission? And so I like to kind of break this down into kind of three things. And this is kind of what we're going to approach it from is this way, is from this passage, there is a presence, a person, and a provision identified that we long for. Three things. Because it's always three, right? A presence, a person, and a provision. By no mistake, I chose P's on purpose, just so that we could remember them. A presence, a person, a provision. The presence that we long for. And I saw no temple in the city, John says, for its temple is the Lord Almighty, the Lamb. I guess to understand why that's important, you have to understand what the temple is. And in order to understand what the temple is, I guess we have to go back all the way, not to the building of the temple. Got to go before that in the Old Testament. So we got to go to the building of the tabernacle. But we got to go before that. Even before that, we got to go to the first time we dealt with God in His presence. And you guess where we're going to have to go? Where we always go. To the beginning. Got to go to the garden. There was no temple in the garden. Did you know that? But the presence of God was there, but there was no temple. There was no Holy of Holies. There was no Ark of the Covenant. There was Adam, Eve in the presence of God. Unabated, unguarded, unshielded. God with his creation, walking in the cool of the evening. What stopped all of that? Sin. From that point on, the presence of God and its accessibility became a problem. Or in other words, being accessible, us accessing God's presence became a problem. So, when God called His people to Himself, the first thing He had them do when He called them out of Egypt was what? Build a place for His presence. Did God need it? No. Did we? Yes. That's why He built it. And it was called the tabernacle. And inside the tabernacle was a tent of meeting, and a very special place where God's presence was known to be. And only at a special time of a special point of the year could a person enter such a place as that. And there were very specific things that person had to do and be to get into that place. And throughout the rest of the year, you just didn't go. But you knew His presence was there. It was that very special place. And when the tabernacle became no more, and they became a localized group of people in a local place, they built a what? A temple. And in that temple was a Holy of Holies, a chamber in which the Ark of the Covenant was kept, or where the presence of God was. And a veil covered that. Right? We know about that. And there's the presence of God. Now you go to the New Testament, you still have the temple, and we know Jesus on the cross, talked about this last week, the veil was torn top to bottom, Christ's presence accessible to all the world. But we're still looking on Old Testament imagery. So we have to understand something about the temple. The temple equals presence. That's what it means. God with us. And that's one of the most powerful themes in all the Bible. If God isn't with us, we have nothing. David mentioned that. Remember David's prayer in Psalm 51? He had sinned. He had murdered. He had lied. He had committed adultery. All three of those things. I mean, if you're talking about swinging for the fences of sin, he did. And the only thing he was concerned about, he had other things he was concerned about, but the paramount thing, and you read it there, take not your Holy Spirit from me. You know the one thing David cared about more than anything in the world? The presence of God. He saw Saul. Remember Saul? He saw what happened to Saul. He saw what happens when you lose the Spirit of God, the presence of God. Saul went insane. Insane. David saw that. He knew he didn't want to lose the presence of God. So the only thing he cared about, more than anything, he didn't care about what anybody thought of him, like Saul did. He cared about the presence of God. The tabernacle, or the garden, the tabernacle, the temple, the Spirit, the presence. And it's interesting. That you read this line, the angel showed me I saw no temple in the city. Why was there no place? Because its temple is the Lord God Almighty, the Lamb. You don't need a temple when He is there. The garden life, back again, only better. Salvation has always been about God being with us. Always. Always about God being with us. Exodus wasn't about escaping Egypt. It was about being in the presence of God. It was never about escaping. It was always about His presence. If it was about escaping, Exodus would have ended as soon as they crossed the Red Sea. But you have another half of a book to go. Do you know where the book of Exodus ends? With God filling the tabernacle, the presence. Then the book ends. Then the story ends. At least that chapter of it. It's about God's presence. It's about being with God, or God being with us. That's what it's always about. There's more. I was looking for that there. The Almighty, and the city has no need of sun nor moon nor shine upon it. The glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. There it is. And its light will be its light will the nations walk, and the kings of earth will bring their glory into it, and its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. I like the idea of gates open, no night. Gates open, no night. I work in a situation during the daytime in which gates are never open. They are always shut. There's never supposed to be a time in which a gate is open, in which another isn't shut. They call those sally ports, right? You enter into one door, but there's another door closed, and that door can't open until the first door shuts. You ever go to the zoo? You ever go to the aviary where the birds are? You ever see those people leave both doors open? That's wrong, right? Well, you know what? Because a bird could just do what? Out, right? Yeah. So everywhere, when you want to keep things in, you build a sally port. Keeps things in. Keeps people in. Keeps stuff in. But not in heaven. There'll be no need for gates. There'll be no need to keep in or keep out. Full access. No more shut doors. I remember when I worked at the Salvation Army, I worked there as a front desk person for their Center of Hope, homeless shelter. Had a lot of transients come in. Now, there was a certain time of the day in which we would stop receiving people to come in. Up until like 9, I can't remember what time it was. I think it was 9 o'clock. About 9 o'clock or so, we would receive anybody, as long as we had room, into the building. As long as they signed in before a certain time, they would be admitted in for the night. And then during the daytime, of course, in the morning, they'd get kicked out about 10 o'clock and have to go back out. And either they would just walk around, or they'd find a job, or they'd find something creative to do. But we didn't just let them sit inside. It was Mississippi, so you had to find something creative to do because it was too hot not to. But I remember there were many a night when I would sit there and lock the doors and lock the gate. And the gate was way out there. You could see it in a camera. And I would watch on the camera, and there would be somebody walking up to that gate. And it would be locked. And they would spend their night, I would almost said in the cold, but it's Mississippi. They would spend their night in the heat, outside, with no shelter. Rain, shine, didn't matter. I never liked doing that. I had to. It was for safety. But I never liked doing it. I never liked doing it. There's coming a day when you don't have to do stuff like that anymore. Nobody would be shut out that wants to come in. It is interesting, though, that while the door stands wide open, so many refuse to come in. It'd be also very intriguing that when the door starts to shut, how many people then would want to come in. The presence we long for. The presence of God. We are built for His presence. We are made for His presence. Throughout the entire biblical account, the presence of God is something we're made for, drawn to, desirous of, incomplete without. Here's the promise. There will be no temple, for the temple is the Lord God Almighty, the Lamb. There will be no day, no night, or there'll be day, no night. He will be present always. Powerful image. The person we long for. They shall see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. If you remember in Exodus 33:17 through 23, I'd like to jump there just for the quick reading of that. This is Moses in the presence of God. And again, we've kind of seen this imagery. When Moses gets into the presence of God, it radiates on his face for as far as I could tell the rest of his life. He has to wear a veil over his face. And the Lord said to Moses, this is Exodus 33:17, "This very thing that you have spoken I will do, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name." Moses said, "Please show me your glory." And he said, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you my name and the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." So he allowed his goodness to pass before him. There's more. And the Lord said, "Behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock, and while my glory passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." He saw the back of God. That alone was enough for Moses to forever have to veil his face, because the glory of God radiated from him. Not so in the New Jerusalem. We'll see him face to face. And we will not be consumed. And we will not be destroyed. It's not God's fault. It's probably ours that we cannot handle his glory. There's too much in us. We would self-destruct. I always think of those Bed Bath & Beyond mirrors, I always bring those up because it's the most profound thing to me. You walk up to those mirrors, those really high light mirrors, and you look in it, and you don't want to, because then what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to show you the things that you cannot see with the naked eye. All the imperfections. Right? You don't see a lot of people lining up for those. All the imperfections. I kind of feel like that's God, only more. Standing in his glory, it exposes his beauty, but it also exposes how far from him we are. That's enough to consume a person. So God, for your sake, doesn't do that to you. But he gets close. One by one, step by step, to expose a little bit more. Show you a little bit more. Down the road we drive. Somebody cuts you off. You have a few words in your mind, your heart, and perhaps out your mouth. It goes. Whoops. And in a moment you realized, I didn't know it existed in me. But God has put his light on something. It's at that moment, if you have the conviction of the Spirit, God puts his finger on your life. He says, interesting. Didn't know that existed, did you? It does. Let's deal with that. Where did that come from, I wonder? Let's find that out. We have a choice, of course. We can continue down the road, I guess, and say, everybody does that. Whatever. So big deal. Or we could say, that's mortifying. That can't stay in my life. And we deal with it. How we deal with that? Right? Social situations puts it on us. God puts his light down on our life. He exposes a little bit more. He says, deal with it. Let's deal with it. Let's get that straight. You say, well, God, I don't really want to deal with that right now, but I'd like to grow closer to you. And I think God kind of puts his foot down and says, no, I don't think so. I think until this is done, we're stalled. This is the thing. Because you can't handle this thing until you've dealt with this thing. And he asked me why. Because I'm God and I know you and I know how I want to work out salvation in your life. This one first, this one next. We'll deal with them together. One by one. But in heaven, all that will be done. And the glory of God will shine upon us. And the work of his salvation will be shown. And the work of his salvation is you. You. What he's done in you. That will be the glory. That's interesting. His work in you. That's what he's proud of in heaven. I remember in a mentoring group when I was in seminary, I had Dr. Gary Cockrell, who was my mentor in seminary. And we had a share group. And we'd get around and we'd share our issues. There were many around the table. And one of the things he always said at the beginning of the group was, it'll do you no good to withhold. You can do it, by the way. You don't have to share what you're dealing with. You don't have to share your troubles. Nobody will ever know. But you will. You don't share? You don't tell the truth about yourself? You'll know. We may think you're fine. You might not be. The group required transparency. The group required opening up. No hiding. No shielding. No falseness. And I kind of think that's what we're talking about when we get to Jesus. It was Bruce Metzger, who was a commentator in the New Testament, once said, seeing God's face is not just being near to his presence, but the enjoyment of a relationship of absolute trust and openness with God. Being in his presence is not just being near to him, but it's enjoying his presence. And I can promise you, you don't enjoy the presence of somebody that you don't trust enough to open up and share. If you enjoy God's presence, understand he already sees it. You'll feel comfortable if you've already told him. If he's working in your life. The presence we long for, the person we long for, the provision we long for. There's no need for light bearers, for God will be the light. It's interesting that this is the term that John chooses to go with, that the Spirit chooses to tell him to talk about. And the city will have no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. I find it interesting only because throughout the Old Testament, and again, if you want to know what Revelation is talking about, understand your Old Testament. And whenever you read the Old Testament, whenever you start talking about luminaries, the sun, the moon, the stars, there's a couple of things that come to mind, but the most essential thing that always comes to mind is what people worship. The pagans always worshiped the sun, the moon, and the stars. They worshipped other things too, but they always worshipped the sun, the moon, and the stars. And they understood something about the sun, the moon, and the stars. Without the sun, there is no life. That is why God turned the lights out on Egypt during the plagues. God was standing toe-to-toe with Egypt's worldview. And he told them pretty clearly, your hope doesn't come from your gods. It comes from me. And in case you're unsure about that, let me just show you your gods compared to me. And he turned the sun off. And instantly they realized that their consistent, loving, gracious sun god isn't as consistent, loving, and powerful as they thought he was. Was that enough? No, unfortunately. But you see it in the Psalms. I lift my eyes to the hills. My help come from there? No. My help comes from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth. Why do we lift our eyes to why does a pagan lift his eyes to the hills? Because that's where the gods live. That's Olympus. Later on in that psalm it says, the sun will not smite me by day. Why would a sun smite you? Because he's not talking about the sun. He's talking about the God. the psalmist is comparing God with the pagan gods. And he's simply saying, this God doesn't do what that God does.